Well, let's look at reporting services and start off with reporting services. We'll look at overview and architecture. We'll look at the SharePoint integration piece, how load balancing and security helps make things easier now compared to the previous versions, and how to configure reporting services in SharePoint integrated mode. And the reason I want to start off with reporting services because by understanding how the architecture works, it makes it easy for us to understand how the other service applications work as far as the service application architecture is concerned. So let's take a look at the architecture. I've taken this screenshot, this picture from one of the members of the reporting services product team blog. And just to highlight how SQL Server reporting services has evolved. In the past, SQL Server 2008 and earlier, if you want to scale out reporting services, you just provide scale out options on your reporting services instance. And reporting services will be taking care of scalability and load balancing. Now, if you want to include reporting services in your SharePoint farms, you only tell SharePoint, look, here's the URL, here's how you access your reporting services instance, and I'll let you figure it out. That has introduced a lot of performance issues because SharePoint is, depending on how many SharePoint servers you have, SharePoint is only going to redirect that traffic to one reporting services instance, which means load balancing is happening on the reporting services part, but not on the SharePoint part. What the product team did was to start introducing SharePoint as a service application running from within SharePoint. Let's graphically illustrate this in the concept of load balancing. As I mentioned in the past, load balancing is being managed by reporting services, regardless of how many SharePoint servers or application servers you have in your farm. But because reporting services is now a service application within SharePoint, SharePoint leverages its own internal load balancer. So when a user comes in, SharePoint then redirects the traffic to any of the reporting services instance, which means you can start off with just one reporting services instance in the farm. As your workload grows, you can start adding more reporting services instances to the farm and let SharePoint manage that load balancing, and reporting services is just going to rely on SharePoint doing that. Which means as more users come in, if one user or one or more users come in from the left web server, the left web server can redirect the traffic to any of the application servers running reporting services service application. And same thing, if more users are coming in through the right server in the SharePoint web server farm. Now that's just the load balancing part. The more challenging part in the past is really security. And I've added a reporting services catalog into the picture. In the past, because reporting services is a component outside of SharePoint, it's treated separately from SharePoint. What that means is if I'm a user who has access to a site collection that contains a reporting services report, I log into SharePoint, and that is considered to be connection 1. As connection 1 comes in, the assumption, of course, is my credential has permissions to access the site collection. Now, the site collection contains the reports. The reports are inside reporting services. SharePoint then submits that request to the application server, or in this case, to reporting servers, reporting services outside of SharePoint, and that becomes connection 2. As the user clicks on the report includes the report data sources, the shared data sets, the credentials, and all of those information is stored in the reporting services catalog database. That becomes connection 3. Now think of it this way. As an end user, I don't really know if I have permissions to access reporting services or if I have permissions to access the data inside the reporting services catalog database, your shared data sources, your shared data sets, your credentials, and that becomes a security nightmare because of the double hop issue. And guess what? How this was resolved in the past? Well, the all too feared and loathed Kerberos delegation. Now, even if you are in good terms with your Active Directory administrators, this is still a pain to implement because you want to make sure that everything works as expected. Plus the fact that, well, now my end users will have permissions to my reporting services instance, and then my users will also have permissions to access the reporting services catalog. What makes you think that they could not bypass SharePoint and connect directly to reporting services? And starting with SQL Server 2012, reporting services has now become a part of SharePoint. Going back to the image that I showed you earlier, and when that was introduced, the issue and the challenge with Kerberos delegation and the double hop issue has been eliminated. Because how it works now is that when me, the user, enters into a site collection using my credential, SharePoint will redirect me to reporting services, of course, if the site collection has the reports. And my connection does not have to be passed to the reporting services instance, because in this case, because reporting services is sitting within SharePoint, it is still my credential accessing reporting services instance. Of course, on the assumption that I have permissions to take a look at the contents in the site collection and render the reports within the site collection. The only concern that I have now is when I click on the report and the report grabs the information from the reporting services catalog to check the data sources, the data sets, the credentials to connect to my data sources, and that becomes connection 2. Now, of course, the connection 2 there becomes the reporting services service application pool account, which means it could be anything that the user doesn't have to know, which means technically the user does not have permission to access the reporting services catalog. Everything is being impersonated through the service application pool account that we configured. So let's take a look at configuring reporting services in SharePoint integrated mode. What I did was to take a couple of screenshots because that would take some time to do the installation. But just so you know, I've already done that. And what I'm going to do as part of the demo is create a reporting services service application. So let's start off with installing the reporting services instance. You can install this either on your web front-end server or your application server, depending on how you want to architect your SharePoint BI farm. You run the SQL Server installation media. You might be noticing that I'm using SQL Server 2014 here, but it's practically the same for SQL Server 2012. You check that option reporting services -SharePoint component. What this will basically do is it will install the binaries for running reporting services in SharePoint integrated mode. Now you also may want to add in the second item there, reporting services add-in for SharePoint. So the second one, the second component there is actually the proxy. So SharePoint talks to the proxy and proxy talks to the reporting services instance. Depending on, again, on how you want to architect your BI farm, you might want to install that in the same server as your application server, or install that just on the web front-end server. When you click on that option, the reporting services configuration dialog box will only have the install only option enabled. Now, in the past, you would have to do this using the reporting services configuration manager utility. With SQL Server 2012 and higher, you will do this within SharePoint Central Administration, and I'm going to show you that later. Once you've installed reporting services in SharePoint integrated mode, you install the reporting services add-in for SharePoint. Now, typically, this is installed on the web front-end server. And of course, reporting services is installed on the application servers. For simplicity in operations, because I want to make sure that I know exactly what I did for all the servers, I just installed this on all of the servers in my farm. That way, if I need to patch one, I can patch all at the same time. And if I need to turn on and off services across all servers, I could do that without having to reinstall everything. But that is just the add-in for SharePoint that I'm going to use. So let me walk you through the process of creating a reporting services service application. Let me log into my demo environment real quick to show you that. What I have in here is a SharePoint farm with one web front end server and one database server, the traditional basic two-tier architecture. To create a reporting services service application, you would do so within SharePoint Central Administration. Again, in the past, you would have to do that from within Reporting Services Configuration Manager, and then you tell SharePoint what is the URL of your reporting services instance. Now you can do that from within SharePoint Central Administration. So within Application Management, you click on Manage Service Applications, that link. And from within Managed Services Applications, it will navigate through the Service Applications Management Console. Well, I'm inside the Managed Service Applications console, and right now I only have the Application Discovery and Load Balancer Service Application plus the Security Token Service Application. I can create a new Reporting Services Service Application. So you go to the New button, you click on the New button. There's a drop-down arrow here that you can click on that. As I mentioned, you now have Reporting Services Service Application as a service application from within SharePoint. So you click on that, and you provide several parameters that you could use to build your Reporting Services service application. Let's start off with a name. We can create an application pool name, and I'll just type in the exact same thing. And then I'll use an application pool account. You can register a new one. You can use the existing one, all up to you depending on your security policies. I'm going to use this existing one that I have, but I want to make sure that I've already provisioned the right permissions on this account to create the Reporting Services Catalog database. The name of the database server could either be the existing database server that you're using for your SharePoint farm, or you could use a separate one for scalability. In my case, I'm just going to use the existing one. But if you're using availability groups, or you're thinking of using availability groups down the road, you could create a DNS alias and use the DNS alias instead of the database server name. That way, when you start deploying your availability groups, you don't have to create the SQL aliases to point to the availability groups. I'm going to remove the GUID values on the database name. I'm going to provision the Reporting Services Catalog database named Reporting Service, and it will create 3 databases within this particular database server. I'm going to use this particular account, or I could use Windows Authentication in this case using the application pool account that I'm using to connect to the database. And I will configure my reporting services service application to work within this particular web application. Now, there are cases when you might want to associate a service application to a different web application. One example of that is maybe you've got multiple business units and they want their own reporting services service application. You build a separate web application, and then you associate the service application for that specific web application. I'm going to click OK. This is going to take quite a while. And once this is done, we will now have a reporting services service application created for us within SharePoint Central Administration. So now that we've created reporting services service application within our SharePoint, it would make sense for us to test this. So I'll click on OK. And to test this, so now you've seen that I've got my reporting services service application with the reporting services service application proxy. As I mentioned, the only way to do this and to really validate if it works is to deploy a reporting services report. What I've got in here is a very simple reporting services project. I don't claim to be a reporting services expert. I mean, developer, that is. And what I'll do is I'll deploy these reports into my site collection. So right now I've got my test domain corporate portal site collection, and I want to deploy those reports within the documents section of my site collection. And once they're deployed, I will start looking at accessing those reports. I'm going to do a couple of things within the report. So the first one that I need to check is the report properties. Right-click on the project, select properties, and notice that my target data source folder, my target report folder, and my target server URL all point to the URL of my SharePoint site collection. Now, this will depend on how you want to structure your folder. One of my customers actually has a specific folder structure where they contain all of their shared data sources in one specific folder and all of their reports in a separate folder. If you got nested reports, and again, that is way beyond the scope of this discussion, but that's just something to keep in mind when you start deploying those reports. Click on that, and just so we could really validate if they work, I'm gonna just click on preview to make sure that they work, so you'll see some of the data. And this is actually connecting to my AdventureWorks data source, which is a sample database from within Microsoft. And because of the fact that the user account that I'm using to build the report has permissions to connect to the database, the underlying data source, I can view the reports. But of course, that's going to change when I start uploading this report into SharePoint. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to build, just make sure that everything works fine, and deploy. And once the deployment process is complete, I can now start looking at my SharePoint site collection to see that those files are deployed, and we can start accessing those reports as a user accessing reports from within the site collection. So I'm going to refresh my documents, shared documents page, and notice that I now have all of my reports from my reports that I've deployed within Visual Studio. And as I mentioned, the only reason that this particular report is working is because of the fact that if we look at the properties, I'm actually using my own credential. And my credential has access to the data sources. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to modify the data source and use a specific account to connect to the underlying data source, so that when I start viewing the report, the user does not have to be granted explicit permissions on the underlying data source, but rather it will use the account that I'm going to configure for this shared data source. So what you're seeing here is the reporting services data source, the shared data source connection information. I'm connecting to a SQL Server database. I'm connecting to my AdventureWorks database. And right now it's configured to use Windows authentication or the credential of the SharePoint user that's trying to access the report. In that particular case, the user has to be granted permissions on the underlying data source, which in some cases you might not want to do. So what I'm going to do here is I will use a stored credential, and I will use a specific account. This specific account is given permissions, DB data reader, depending on your data source. It could be an Oracle database, so the credential could be something else. But the point is, this will impersonate the user when accessing the reports within the SharePoint site collection. I'll use this as a Windows credential. I can test the connection if I want to, just to enable and make sure and validate that particular user has permissions to access the underlying data source for the report. And there you are, the connection created successfully, and I'll click on OK. Once that's done, we can start testing if we have access to our reports. So I'll click on company sales. So what this is doing is now, as a user, I'm logging into the SharePoint site collection. Because I have permissions to view the contents of the site collection, I can render the reports. And because the reports are grabbing data from a different data source, which I may not have permissions to view, I've configured the stored credential. And that stored credential will then go grab the data from the data source for me so that I can view those reports from within SharePoint. So that's how you configure reporting services service application from within SharePoint, and then deploy the reports and eventually testing those reports as we would do so. Now you're seeing some of the reports being rendered as I'm accessing them.